So here's my top wheel mount block, and I cut that out on my big bandsaw using a paper template, but if you don't have a bandsaw, it's all straight cuts, so it could be done with a table saw with multiple cuts to hog out some of these areas. Now a little problem I'm running into here, I'm drilling my shaft hole and my drill is just not long enough to reach through to the other side. So I need to come in from the other side, but the trick is how to line up those holes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this drill and drill through the bottom of my hole out the other side, and that will serve as a pilot hole for coming in from the other side, because that drill, that little peak on there, the point, likes to follow any existing pilot hole. Perfectly lined up. On most bandsaws you have a thing for adjusting the upper wheel up and down for tensioning, and then another mechanism on that thing that tilts it. So on this bandsaw I have this frame that goes around here, and the tension crank pulls up on that, and then this knob here is used for adjusting the tilt. But I find that I almost never have to adjust the tilt of the top wheel, because the blade, if the bandsaw is well made, tracks well enough without it. So on this new bandsaw, I'm going to try to simplify this mechanism a bit. So for this bandsaw, I've eliminated the frame that goes around this block. So the block, my original idea was to have something on here and another piece of wood that screws onto the back here, but I can change how much it screws in by so that that changes the tilt of the block, and then it just slides up and down against these pieces of wood. Now, as I was making this, I realized I could probably improve on that a little bit more. The problem with having this block down here is I had to cut away an awful lot of this block, and because the wheel is always pushing down on here, which by the way tries to tilt this forward, that weakens the block here. But what I realized when I put it in here is I already have a ledge on the back, so I can just push it against there, so I can eliminate this one and make the block bigger down here, and all I need is the one that's back here. So what I've done is I've chiseled this out deeper, and I'll change the plans so that the board is just going to be narrow here, so you won't have to chisel it like that. And then the block is going to have a longer bit that extends into here, so I get maximum vertical range of motion here, because I can slide quite a bit vertically on here, and that means I get a good adjustment range, and I won't need this thing going across the front here, so it'll be nice and sturdy, and I'll still have some adjustment. So I've updated my CAD drawings to reflect a new way of doing the top wheel mount. So here's the top wheel, and this here is the frame, and you can see here how the wheel mount protrudes into a gap in the frame. And I've also added the details here. This bolt here is for doing the tilt, and this is a hole, and there's going to be a nut in there for pulling that whole block up to give it the tension. So I've actually cut this part out here, and I'm going to use that as a template for cutting it out of a solid block of wood. I finished out milling out this block, and the template's gotten a little bit ratty, but I don't need that anymore. So I've got here the hole all the way through, which my pipe is going to go through. This dips into the frame for the back support, and then this threaded rod here is going to get this piece on it, and then a nut on here. I'll probably put a knob on that, and that'll allow me to adjust the tilt of the wheel by changing how far I set this nut. And for the blade tension, there's going to be a bolt that goes into here, and I have to put a nut against there. Now if you have a square nut, that makes it really easy, just put it in there. But these hex nuts, they might twist in there, and they don't distribute the weight very well. So what you can do is you can take a washer and bend it. So I put this in a vise and I hit it with a hammer, and that holds the nut, prevents it from turning, and spreads out the force. So we can just put that in here. And now if we turn the screw is going to be fixed up here. That'll move this whole block up and down. So I've milled out the bottom wheel mount, again using the templates, out of a solid piece of maple that used to be firewood, and it's going to get attached to the frame with these 4-inch long screws, 1/4-inch screws, and they're going to stick out about this far into the frame. But before I actually screw it and drill the pilot holes and whatnot, I'm just going to clamp it onto the frame to see how it works. So I put that wheel mount on there with a clamp, and I also clamped a little piece of wood to the front here because this whole thing is kind of tippy, and it would actually tip over if I didn't have that on there right now. And I've got the blade on here, and I've adjusted the top wheel to kind of point at the bottom one. But I'm not sure if you can see this very well, but the bottom wheel is kind of pointing upwards a little bit. If we look down here, see, we can see the face of the bottom wheel. So that means that bottom wheel is kind of tilted this way, so either I'll need to shim it or shave away a little bit. Chances are I didn't get these layers quite lined up when I glued the frame together. So the next thing to do is I'm going to take this frame on the workbench and check if that's square, and if it isn't, I'll shave it square on the bottom. So checking this with a square, I can see that this down here, it's neither flat nor square. The gap is much bigger on the front than the back, so this bottom face is definitely tilting upwards. Unfortunately, I haven't got a power tool that I can get in there and flatten this, so I'm going to have to do this with a hand plane. So that's reasonably square and flat in here now. So the wheel mount should fit in there nicely, and it doesn't rock. Now the other thing I need to make sure of is that the shaft is perpendicular to the frame in this direction, like that. So checking that with the square, you can see the gap is very even. So I've got it positioned just right this way, and I've attached it with a bar clamp so that it doesn't move, because the next thing to do is just to tap each of these screws, and that marks where I need to drill the pilot holes. Well, I just had the wheel on and the alignment wasn't entirely perfect. So I'm going to shim this block with this very thin strip of wood and then retighten those bolts. So I got my wheels properly aligned now. I put some brass shims around the plumbing pipe just to eliminate play. So the plumbing pipe really isn't as good as proper shafting, but you can make do with plumbing pipe. Now let's look at how the blade is tracking on here. Now I don't know how well this shows up in the video, but so you can see the blade is loose here down to the other wheel, and it's running right on the peaks of the crowns of my wheels. And even if I go out of my way to push this blade off center, so I'm going to push it almost off the wheel. Now if I let go of it and I turn it some more, it comes right back on center. That's the magic of crown pulleys.